going to take you out.
You still can't figure it out. And we're live.
No. Oh, sorry. Well, Merry Christmas to you too, pal.
Merry
damn.
Christmas to you. We can't figure out which one of us is the most technically inept. So we're having,
I think we know
having
that.
a contest and trying to figure that out. Calling Chris Anderson in Studio W1.
Well, no, I'm in W2,
there?
but I am in
W2.
Windsor, so
I don't know where you are.
My daughter leaves W1 tomorrow morning to go back to university, so then I'll
be
back.
Yes. Yeah. My son is visiting, and he is leaving tomorrow morning. So we are in the same boat.
I noticed that he doesn't take over your studio.
He doesn't sleep in my office. No. Sorry. It's different that way. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And we're really glad you're here for our year-end show on Bomber Command. Chris, we are at the end of 2025 for us, right?
Right.
Our last show. Any guesses how many guests we've had on this year?
Lots. 32.
30. We did 38 live shows with guests.
Wow. Damn.
We did 2 shows that were live with just us. But 38 with guests.
No.
And we had one show that had 5 guests and one that had 2. But we also had John McManus on twice. So I think overall, when I do all the math, it comes out to 42 guests for the year.
So this is like our Spotify Wraps, then. Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Except I should have asked AI to do it. And do you remember who our first guest of the year was?
This is like all these pop questions. John McManus.
It was Joe Balkowski.
Oh, it started with a J. Okay, good.
And that was his 5th show this week.
So he got a hat. Did you send him his hat?
Yeah. I did send it to him. So we have hundreds of people, about 100 people who watch live every week, more or less. Good. We have hundreds more who watch on Facebook and YouTube afterwards. We have hundreds more on our podcast version, which I'm enthralled by, because literally more than 100 to 150 hours a week of podcast listening. Which either means 100 to 150 people listening to each show, or 300 people listening to half of each show.
And how many people? How many people in the corresponding version?
The male version of the show?
Yeah.
So we don't have that.
Oh, so lots. Then.
We should accept people. You could send us your address, and we'll mail you a transcript of the show. Our post box 100, Ansonia, New York. I don't know, something like that. I don't remember. But we are grateful to everybody who watches or listens. Don't want to leave out our Patreon supporters who support, especially our adult supporters. And finally, we're also grateful to Cheryl for all the work that she does as our producer. And we are grateful to our wives.
Yeah.
Anna and Marilyn, who put up with us and put up with this. This is our 282nd episode. And according to my Google Drive spreadsheet, next episode starts season 7.
Well, and it should be pointed out that they put up with a lot outside of History Happy Hour. This is just one small portion of what they have to put up with. But yes, we thank them both very much.
All right. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. I hope you're drinking something. Let us know what it is. And Chris, is there anybody out there, or are we just chatting among ourselves at this point?
Susan Skelly from Bethany Beach, Delaware. Wally Morrison's back from Indiana. Xavier is here from Spain. So we're international again. Ken from Kansas. Doreen is back. We're really happy to see her. And I saw her post about her.
Does Doreen live in Tullahoma?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to Tullahoma. I was in the newspaper in Tullahoma this week, Doreen. Hope you saw me.
Wow.
Tullahoma News.
Big doings in Tullahoma.
Yeah, big times in Tullahoma. I'm going to be there in May. All right, so I think we have now bullshitted our way through the
I
first
think
3
so.
minutes, and I don't know why that has just come up on the screen, but why don't we play the open and move? Let's go. Okay, I don't know where the bell is.
Then you have to make the noise. Then you have to make the noise.
Bing.
All right.
Found the bell.
There you go.
Found the bell.
Yes.
The bar is open, Chris. Please tell me we've got something going on here.
We do. We're joined this week by Marcus Gibson, who is a research journalist who has worked for the Financial Times, the European, and BBC Radio News 4. He's reported for 3 Olympic Games. He's reported from Bosnia and the sinking of the Baltic ferry Estonia. He has contributed to Time, the South China Morning Post, and the Melbourne Age. He has contributed to 2 earlier books, The Dictionary of British Heritage and Bootstrapping Your Business. And in 2004, he started Gibson Index Limited, and he lives in London. But most importantly, and why he's here this week, is to talk about his book, The Greatest Force, which is a new and interesting look at Bomber Command during World War II.
Okay, Marcus Gibson, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening to everyone.
Good, thanks for joining us. Marcus, in the introduction to your book, you quote the author Alan Levine, and you say that in his book, The Strategic Bombing of Germany, he said, up to the spring of 1944, the strategic air offensive had not struck a decisive blow against Germany. It had not critically hurt the German economy or even seriously interrupted production of a vital item. Now, this seems to be a view that you take objection to. And why do you feel that Levine, and I should be said, a great many other people, are wrong in their assessment of Bomber Command?
Well, in the German archives in Freiburg is all the evidence anyone could ever need to show the RAF was incredibly effective, even in 1940, due to the fact that they were hitting many targets in Germany and they were causing serious damage. They even managed to cut out 5% of oil supply to Germany, which may not sound like much, but with 2-engine bombers, at the time, it was a considerable achievement. In addition, it also triggered a very large construction program across Germany for very large air raid shelters, which consumed eventually the equivalent of about 30,000 Luftwaffe fighters in terms of the equivalent resources. And perhaps most important of all, it triggered the V-weapons program, which was a gigantic waste of resources across Germany in every way, shape, and form, and which was a major consumer of something like 40%, if not more, of Germany's R&D program. Whole universities were devoted to it. Vast amounts of oxygen and fuel were diverted to it. So even early on, the RAF was hitting a great deal, and of course, it's now known that by May in the second quarter of 1943, 46% of German metal processing in the Ruhr was destroyed, and that means that nearly half of all Germany's industrial capacity, because the Ruhr was the genesis, the font of all German industrial activity, coal, steel, metal making, etc. All of that was half of that was gone.
Yeah.
So first of all, Marcus, I neglected to ask you what you're drinking, so I'm going to get that done now.
It's Koppelberg cider, a fruity cider, a European cider. Thank you.
Fantastic, Mr. Anderson. Do you have a drink?
Well, yeah, I'm drinking a rhubarb gin, which is the last of the gin advent calendar. So this is kind of my hottest.
Gin advent. I'm not familiar.
Welcome to Britain, baby.
Yeah, I've got. Marcus, you don't have an obvious background in World War II. You're not a professor at Sandhurst or someplace else studying World War II. And yet you spent a decade on this book. You were just saying the last 2 years full time. So what led you to dive into this?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes. say you don't have an obvious background in World War II research or writing, and yet you spent a decade on this book. What led you to do that?
Well, in the 1990s, I visited probably more than 100 German factories when I was working as a business reporter for the European and then the FT. And many of the directors and works managers at those places were veterans of the Second World War. And they were the first people to tell me just how incredibly effective the RAF was and how they couldn't really understand that the conventional view of it was that they weren't. The head of BMW was a former SS Haupt, major, with 4 years on the Eastern Front. The head of the Diesel in Augsburg was the same guy. Lloyd Werft in Hamburg was also a veteran, and they spoke how in the end there was often only one German for 80 slave laborers, and they got nothing done. And much of what they produced, if they did produce anything, was absolutely terrible in terms of quality, and much was barely usable. Now, this is now well known in Germany, but it seems to just not have penetrated the Anglo-American literature on the subject, which I thought was astonishing. So, I had other things to do, shall we say, but I decided 2 years ago I would really get down and rewrite the whole subject and try and clarify exactly what did and didn't occur, and put the record straight.
So, Marcus, maybe you could tell us, especially for our American viewers, tell us a little bit about the origins of Bomber Command, sort of where it fits into the whole British strategic picture, and kind of its start and kind of where it comes from.
Well, would you believe it? Churchill was the Minister of the Air at some point in the First World War, and he organized bombing of German cities at the end of World War One. Also, of course, Churchill, the Air Marshal Portal, and then the head of Bomber Command, Air Marshal Harris, those three men were the prime movers in making sure that Bomber Command got the lion's share of much of the resources in the early years of the war. With the result, they were certain that bombing Germany would be the right thing to do as an alternative to any sort of land war against the Germans, which they wanted to avoid because of the strength of the Wehrmacht. So the development of Bomber Command as a principal offensive force against Germany really was at the center of Churchill's strategy, really from day one.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back to your overall theme, and you have a quote from Albert Speer in your book, who. And I know he's not always the most reliable.
Really?
Yeah. Not everything he say we can take at face value. But you quote him as saying, the real importance of the air war consisted in the fact that it opened a second front long before the invasion in Europe. Defense against air attacks required the production of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, the stockpiling of tremendous quantities of ammunition all over the country, and holding in readiness hundreds of thousands of soldiers who in addition had to stay in position by their guns, often totally active for months at a time. No one has yet seen that this was the greatest lost battle on the German side. So what I want to know is why you feel that this has not been recognized, that there's this commonly held misconception that Bomber Command was not effective. Tell us more about that and how you think that got started. I mean, you must have thought about this when you started working on it and found yourself in opposition to it.
Yes, there's about 450 books being written on Bomber Command. I think it's probably the biggest single subject of World War II history that I know of. It's also still the most controversial, and also I think, frankly, it just wasn't well researched. And so much of the information I've got comes from Germany, from the horse's mouth, not from British or American sources. Now, that said, I think my book is one of the first to really look in depth at the totality of the effects of Bomber Command and the U.S. Air Force against Nazi Germany. Most of the other books you'll read are about operations, aircraft types, individual air marshals, etc., but they don't really focus on the effects, and that's where I think I may have filled the gap
So, Marcus, one of the other things that maybe I'd like to get your kind of input on, you talk about sort of the big three. You mentioned this earlier. There's Portal, Harris, and Churchill. I think, of course, most people are very familiar with Churchill or have opinions of him. But one of the people that, of course, I don't think many Americans know about is Charles Portal. And I was struck in the book. You said that in 1915 at a National Press Club meeting, former President Dwight Eisenhower was asked who was the Allied commander he held in the highest esteem. And of course, I was very surprised by his response. It was, he says, and I'm quoting, "Portal, I've often made public my admiration for those who served in the European and African theaters. Many of these people in the British services were indeed splendid people. One of them I think most of you never heard of, or not often. He was Air Chief Marshal Portal, now Lord Portal, one of the finest leaders I have known, a very great mind." So that's not the name I would have expected Eisenhower to give. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about Portal.
Yes. He was a very cerebral man. He went to Winchester College, which is probably the most cerebral of the English public schools, much more so than Eton or Harrow in many ways. He was a man who, like Harris, had flown a lot in World War I as a pilot. And really, from 1939, he was able to create an air force that had 1.2 million men, women in it, and on a completely global scale, all the way across, from Europe to the Middle East and into the Pacific under his command. It was an astonishing achievement, and to be able to control such a thing was quite extraordinary. I was actually, his niece is still alive, living in Scotland. Maura Lucas is her name, and I was able to get some anecdotes from her, from the horse's mouth, as it were, about him. He's probably the only senior commander who never kept a diary or wrote a biography about himself after the war. He more or less retired from public life, rarely ever spoke, and certainly never did anything to puff up his achievements during the war. But for those who worked with him, he was undoubtedly one of the great figures of the war.
So, as long as we're talking about personalities, maybe you could talk a little bit about Arthur Harris, who is often, he was the commander of Bomber Command starting, you can tell us when he started. I know he wasn't at the very beginning of the war, but he is not a person who has been well treated by history, but I think it's fair to say that you're a fan.
Oh, I'm very much a fan. I'll say this. No other commander in World War II inflicted more direct damage on Nazi Germany on such a scale for so long and so effectively as Air Marshal Harris. And the fact that his reputation is not stellar is, to me, an astonishing injustice and a historical error of the worst kind. And I'll give you my prediction that a generation, not ours, but maybe a later generation, will erect a statue, a column in his honor in London, the same height as Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, once we realize just the scale of his achievement in destroying Nazi Germany more than any other leading figure.
So I want to jump on what Rick said, Marcus, though, but he has not been treated by history, but it's fair to say that the men of Bomber Command kind of stood by him. And you have some anecdotes in the book about some of them coming back for the dedication of his statue and whatnot. So what was it about him as a commander that kind of the men, despite the horrific losses of Bomber Command, what was it about him as a commander and a leader that made him so effective?
His public statements and his statements over the internal broadcast system of the RAF was extremely inspiring to those men who had to get into aircraft, take off into the skies, and do the job. He was more inspirational than Montgomery, and probably the equal to Patton in terms of how his men really took to him and the loyalty he showed them. And he never went to bed until the last bomber was home on hundreds of occasions. And you have to remember that an admiral, fights maybe 3 battles in a war, a general probably a few more. But for an air commander, they commit 100% of their force 3 or 4, 5 times a week, and they never know whether any of them are going to come back. So the risk and the performance of the commander, he never lost his nerve. He never sought publicity for himself. He was in truth a remarkable man, but he was a very tough man and a very unforgiving man. And he also told many superiors that they were not good enough for their jobs. And as you know, that's not always good for promotion or reputation.
Yeah, I've tried that. It didn't work well. It explains why I don't work for a full-time job anymore.
We work for ourselves.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. I think, you're talking about this. I want to bring in a question from the audience. It's going to make us jump a little bit, but I think that's okay. Is wholly apart from the questionable effectiveness of strategic bombing in World War II, do you really think it was the RAF night bombing that beat Germany without even a mention of the U.S. Army's 8th Air Force? Now, I want to say, in fairness to you, you do mention the 8th Air Force in your book, but there is this question of Britain versus the U.S. And here in the U.S., we tend to think, well, we kind of came in 1943 and we started bombing, and then everything went well. And the RAF was just kind of a little sideshow. So that's not necessarily the opinion of anybody on this program, but that is the opinion of some people. So what's your point of view there?
I have 2 chapters on the U.S. Air Force in the book. The first one was really dealt with the arrival of the U.S. Air Force, the construction of, 300 airfields, the arrival of about 1 million Americans in all to get the whole thing going. Unfortunately, the Americans arrived with the wrong bomber, the wrong training, the wrong bomb site, the wrong tactics, the lack of any electronic navigation systems. And that led to really a year that was a waste in terms of effectiveness. Thereafter, when General James Doolittle, one of my heroes, came into command the 8th Air Force, absolutely everything changed. And then literally within a few short weeks, it became the mighty force it became in the last 10 months of the war, in which by the end of that war, it was twice the size of the RAF. You have to remember that, of course, the RAF was dropping much bigger and heavier bombs than the US Air Force. And so even though there were fewer bombs, there was a sort of a panning out. And by the end of the war, the approximate tonnage of both air forces was broadly similar. But with the Americans bombing by day and the Americans by day and the British by night, that was a double blow, which together most certainly destroyed the Germany. One thing I will finally say is that the oil program, which destroyed Germany's oil facilities, permits primarily the achievements of the U.S. Air Force, was, in my view, less effective because, in totality, for the simple reason that after about 1944, Germany didn't need oil nearly so much. It became an army dependent on mortar shells, small things that didn't, mortars, landmines, Panzerfaust, basically an infantry-led army in many ways. What should be taken into consideration more was the RAF's role in the transport program, which when it really got going, it destroyed the Ruhr and stopped any coal getting out of the Ruhr. And within a few weeks, German industry was about down to 3% of it was left functioning. So together, in different ways, both contributed.
So I want to also kind of pick up on that, Marcus. One of my pet peeves is this constant argument you have on both sides of the Atlantic. It was the Americans that did all this work and the British didn't, or over here it's the British did this. And I think when we get into these arguments too much, we lose sight of the fact that it was an allied effort. And one of the things that's always struck me about Bomber Command in particular is that it was an international organization. I mean, you have people from all over the Dominion and elsewhere. So maybe you could touch a little bit on sort of the makeup of Bomber Command and where some of these people are coming from beyond Great Britain?
Yes, I think, don't quote me, I think about a quarter to a third of all aircrew came from the British Empire, the Dominions and the colonies. So that would, so primarily from Canada, I think about 10% with the RCAF, brilliant, absolutely brilliant contribution. And the Australians were similarly, well regarded. And of course, a very small but very capable group from New Zealand and South Africa as well. So no doubt about it. And of course, Polish, Czech, and even a small number of Yugoslavs, were involved. The one particular man, Don Bennett, who led the RAF Pathfinder force, was an Australian navigator of genius. And it was his contribution that really made RAF accuracy bombing so good and so great in the last 2 years of the war. And I think he was a group commander or above group command level, and he was, I think, of all of 32 or 33. He was a very young man compared to everyone else. One thing I would add, if I may, was that one thing General Doolittle did when he came in was that he came to the British and said, "What on earth can you give me to make us more effective?" And they said, "We will use our radar on our radio intercept to tell you exactly when German fighters are forming and how to avoid them." And that led to a substantial reduction in US aircraft, bomber casualties, along with many other things as well. I should also mention that James Doolittle had worked for the Shell Oil Company long before the war, and he was of course an expert engineer, as we know. But his main task was to develop high octane gasoline in the US, which gave British and American aircraft a tremendous advantage in dogfights and in long-term performance over German aircraft.
Mm-hmm. So, I have had a technical problem uploading the cover of your book to show it. So can you pull out one of those Greatest Force books out?
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, Chris has got one, and I had to. Let's have two.
There we go. Look at it.
Marcus Gibson, who is the author of The Greatest Force, a book about RAF Bomber Command. The general view is that the Allied bombing campaign was not very effective at getting bombers, not enough accuracy, and it didn't really turn a corner until sometime in 1943. But you suggest that it was very impactful right from the beginning. So where does that come from? And give us some examples of that impact.
Well, to my astonishment when researching the book, the indirect effects of bombing were incredibly effective in crippling Germany, in addition to, and probably in many ways, a lot more than the actual direct damage, the physical damage to their cities and industries. First and foremost, 80% of Germany's heavy guns, the 88mm guns, were withdrawn from all front lines and back to Germany in an effort to protect their cities. Secondly, something like 65% of all German fighters, certainly twin-engine fighters, were withdrawn also from front lines, especially from Russia, in order to curb, to stop British air raids and also to take some control back in the Mediterranean, which the Italians were, of course, busily losing. One astonishing fact I should add is that every single Allied sea invasion and all German, Russian offensives after the end of the Kursk campaign, all of them came as a complete surprise to the Germans. Quite astonishing. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, had 2,800 ships in the Mediterranean, and I think Salerno and Anzio were about 600 or 800 ships. How on earth did those ships get 10 days across the North Africa to land on the coast of Italy, let alone D-Day with 6,000 ships, without the Germans ever noticing? The fact is, all of those twin-engine reconnaissance planes that should have been there were in fact sitting above German cities, desperately trying to stop the RAF from bombing their cities to destruction. So that indirect effect was incredibly helpful to the Allies.
So Marcus, one question, well, one of the characters, I guess you could say, in your book is not a person; it's a machine, and that's the Lancaster. And I should say that when I first moved here to Britain, I was obviously aware of Spitfires, but for an American, it's the B-17 and the B-24 and the P-51, and we knew that the British flew this thing called the Lancaster, but there's not quite the same reverence. And when I moved here, I was quickly, disavowed of that notion. But David Picker, who's has asked a question already, had also asked, can you elaborate on how the B-17 and B-24 were not the right bombers and the Norden not the right bomb site, which was immediately jumped on by another viewer, Lynn, who says, my question too. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the Lancaster, why it's important, how it's different, and then touch on David and Lynn's concern about the B-17 and the B-24, because we're all a little bit partisan here.
Yes, well, as you know, Britain it took us about 3 years to get the Lancaster in large numbers over Germany. And prior to that, we had the bombers, the Whitley, the Halifax, and others that were mediocre, not up to the job, as we know. The principal thing about the Lancaster was that it had an enormous bomb bay, an enormous load carrying capability. It was also reasonably fast, and it also had the ability with the radar navigation systems to be very accurate. It could hit German city centers. They could put 800 bombers over a German city in 30 minutes. Such was the capability. Its bomb bay was very long indeed, so you could stick an awful lot of stuff in it. Up to, as you may the 22-ton bomb, which I think no aircraft for a very long time afterwards, certainly no propeller aircraft, could ever carry. It could fly on one engine. It was extremely battle worthy. Even I think about 6,000 of them were put back into service after they'd been damaged. It really was the premier bomber of the war, in Europe, in my opinion. And of course, when you combined it with an experienced navigator, there was almost no target in Germany it could not, it could not attack, including, of course, deep penetration precision raids like those on the Dams raid.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Sorry, coming back to the Norden bomb. Unfortunately, the Norden bomb site was developed usually, in the southwest of the United States, in very clear weather, and probably 80% of the time, Europe is, especially in the winter, is covered in cloud. So without a radar navigation system, the Norden bomb site was just US entirely. The Americans concentrated on training their pilots. They had two, as you know, in each B-25, B-24, and the B-17. The British concentrated on they had a 1 year training program, 1 year for navigators. That was where the British focused on, the RAF. And of course, most of the casualties, the highest number of casualties for the US Air Force in the first 2 years was frostbite, because flying at 30,000 feet in minus 40, minus 60, the air gunners standing there with no windows, their heated air suits often broke. And the one thing that James Doolittle did was he shouted and screamed, and he got really much stronger suits for his men with much better connectors, so they didn't break in combat. And thereafter, the frostbite casualty rate fell to nearly nothing. But the Americans came with lots of things they thought were good, and in many ways they didn't listen. And the worst error, if I may say so, was their failure to come along with a 2-engine bomber like the Mosquito, especially if their stated intention was to be precision bombing of German cities, not area bombing, and they didn't do that. And that was a shame. And I think it's partly because the Pentagon and the American aerospace industry, they came to our aid. So I'm not criticizing them. They should have listened a bit better to what the British, in our brutal experience in the first 4 years, those lessons which we had learnt.
So is that what you mean when you say that the B-24 and B-17 were not the right aircraft? Just to follow up on David's question, you mean that the Americans should have developed more essentially tactical bombing planes or planes? I mean, wasn't the B-26 a twin plane? I mean, didn't they have that capability? What's wrong with the B-4?
Sorry, which one? The B?
The B. You said America came with the wrong aircraft, the wrong
Yes.
bomb site. So, in terms of the aircraft, what's wrong with the B-17 and B-24? Is it that they're 4-engine planes?
Yes, primarily the need by 1943 was for a very fast twin-engine bomber that could do the precision bombing in daylight that the Americans said they were going to do. Instead, they came with 4-engine bombers whose bombing accuracy was for the first 18 months of the war, very poor indeed. Though they did have some spectacular successes. So it was a great shame that they didn't listen to what the British advised them. And the P-38 Lightning unfortunately had a very high unreliability rate. And as an overall rule, American aircraft served very well in drier climates. But when they got to the humid, icy conditions of Northern Europe, they performed a lot less well. And by the way, the reverse is true. British aircraft didn't perform nearly so well, in the hot climes of, say, Southeast Asia compared to American aircraft.
So Marcus, you lay out 5 separate campaigns that Bomber Command fought during World War II. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what these 5 campaigns were, and also kind of your impressions of the evolution of Bomber Command tactics, how they conducted these raids. How does the force look in 1945 compared to what it had been in, say, 1942?
Well, it went from a 2-engine bomber force to a 4-engine bomber force with about, I think, around 14,000 bombers in total. So it was an enormous expansion, quite obviously. They created basically electronic warfare, which by the end of the war really was how all air forces fight. They were able to neutralize the German fighters, German radar, German radio systems through electronic warfare, which by the way, the Americans very quickly cottoned onto, and by the end of the war, they were equal in many ways superior to the British, certainly in the equipment, if not always the practice necessarily. So the start of the campaign was really some city bombing of the Ruhr, trying to target railway lines and canals, that sort of thing, which was achieved with some success. The second phase was really the attack on the German cities from about 42 onwards, in which cities like Cologne, the 1,000 bomber raid phase took place. It then went on to the so-called First Battle of the Ruhr in the first 3 or 4 months from March 43 onwards, in which incredible destruction was done to the Ruhr region, which is where so much of Germany's, if not 80% or more of Germany's war fighting capability was derived from. And in the end of 43, we had the episode when Mayor Marshal Harris had the Battle of Berlin, which was 16 heavy raids on Berlin, in which about 30% of Berlin was destroyed. But unfortunately, in the process, the frontline squadrons of the RAF were wiped out by some very good anti-aircraft guns, radar batteries, and some very good night fighter pilots.
So I've often cited a figure when I'm on tour with people, commonly available, that close to 50% of the people who flew for RAF Bomber Command were killed, which is, of course, a horrific casualty rate, something like 50,000 people. That is by way of comparison with the number of Americans who died in the Battle of the Bulge. So are those numbers correct as far as you know? And would you view this sacrifice as essentially being worthwhile?
it was 1,000% worthwhile given the crippling effects the exchange of those lives was achieved. No doubt about it whatsoever. If you compare their sacrifice, the 55,573 RAF who were killed, including I think about 20% during training, by the way, which were deadly exercises in themselves. If you compare that with the million or so casualties Britain suffered in the First World War for not very much gain, that sacrifice was certainly not in vain. And so, yes, it was highly worthwhile. Of course, the Germans were losing 60,000 men killed a month on the Russian front alone for the last 3 years of the war. And the Russians, the Red Army has a statistic which says that only 5% of the 17 to 21-year-olds survived the war. So those are the sort of statistics we're dealing with.
But Marcus, I mean, obviously, you have a much different kind of view of the effectiveness of Bomber Command, and you go into great detail, and you back it up with quite a bit of research. But you don't shy away from, it's not a perfect picture. So you do have a chapter, in the book where you talk about mistakes that were made, and maybe you can just touch on some of the places that Bomber Command got it wrong, and what could have been done differently.
Oh, certainly, yes. I mean, it's a war. It's a war in the air. No one really has any idea, absolutely what's going on or how to be objective about this in operations. But by the end of the war, the RAF was able to put, as I said, 800 bombs in the air over a target for as little as half an hour, along with many spoof raids and anything else. It was a very complex organization. But as a journalist, you would expect me to give the upside as well as the downside. And the downside, primarily, in my view, was the fatal error that Bomber Harris and his RAF intelligence failed to bomb German coal mines. Now, if you've ever been to the Ruhr region, the Rhineland of Germany, there are 300 coal mines which are extremely, as are all coal mines, extremely vulnerable to any impact of any kind. Even a near miss could knock out the mine shaft, knock out the lifts, etc., set fire to the dumps around it. But early on in the war, they came to the decision that these were not vulnerable targets. To my personal astonishment, this was accepted. But if they had, they could have cut out coal was the center of Germany's ability to fight the war for all the reasons we know, not only just for energy, for running power and steam engines, God knows what else. It was because all of the synthetic fuel came from crushed coal, primarily from the Ruhr coal mines, the largest coal mine in Europe. And as I showed you, there's a very large coal mine called the Zollverein, which is about 3 or 4 square miles. It was no small target at all, and a few mosquitoes could have put it out of action very easily. Moving on, Harris's love of very large raids meant that there was quite a long tail for the last wave of aircraft coming back to the UK, and that meant that last 1 or 2 waves were very vulnerable to being intercepted by German night fighters. Now, if he'd had 2 or 3 raids on the same night with a third each, shall we say, for each, that there would have been far less opportunity for those bombers to have been intercepted. That's one other thing. Also, British intelligence never cottoned on to the fact that German night fighters were using these deadly up-firing guns, which are fitted alongside some very accurate, very, very effective night radar interception kits, which we only knew about when 1 or 2 of their fighters landed in the UK by error. And that meant that there were about 200 or 300 expert German night fighter pilots who destroyed literally thousands of British allied bombers with ease. So those are the principal errors, I would say.
Critics of the bombing campaign often focus on the firebombing of Dresden in 1945. in which many thousands of civilians were killed in the closing months of the war. And what's really noteworthy in your book, and perhaps particularly controversial, is your refusal to see these as innocent civilians. That phrase really doesn't compute for you. So can you dig into that?
Well, I don't have to talk about the Holocaust. I don't have to talk about the rampant civilian mass murder genocide the Germans got up to. We don't have to go with that because everyone knows about it. German cities were not the kind of innocent, pretty places people think they were. They were the centers of the greatest evil, and let's not forget that's what they were really like. 16 German cities had full-time, guillotine stations, which they used to get rid of all sorts of people they didn't like. 1/4 of Jews died in the gas chambers. The other 3/4 were murdered out of hand. German cities were the centers of the slave labor force. There were 42,000 slave labor camps all over Germany, and the atrocious conditions in which they were starved, worked to death, etc., was visible to every German civilian who were around. Now, the number of German civilian deaths was only 300,000. Now, you may think that's a lot, but if you compare that with the hundreds of thousands who died in Leningrad, Warsaw, Kiev, and Belgrade, and a dozen other cities, it's a very small number, partly because the Germans were very good at building air raid shelters. One thing Dresden didn't have. Coming on to Dresden, I'll be quoted as saying, is a non-entity in World War II. The death toll was between 6,000 and 10,000 only. The reason for that is quite simple. There were virtually no refugees in Dresden, in spite of what all previous histories and encyclopedias and archives will have you believe. I went there in 1999, in 1991. I checked, I spoke to many people, they confirmed it. The reason for that was there were very few trains arriving from the Eastern Front. By the way, at the time of the raid, the Russians were just 60 kilometers distant. So there are very few trains arriving, and no one who arrived on any of those trains ever got off, not least because there was no food in the city for them. They carried on to the south and east of Germany to get away from the Russians as fast as they could. The bomber crews who flew over the city could clearly see the city was not full of carts and horses and trucks and full of refugees. The cities were absolutely empty. Dresden was one of the nastiest cities in Germany, the most pro Nazi of them all in many ways. It was home to at least 2 German army divisions. The Altstadt, the central military compound, had 2 army divisions headquarters there. They'd been responsible for many people going off to the Eastern Front in the early days to shoot Jews out of hand. And what else? Oh yes, Dresden was the place where the last 2 Icon Zeiss gun sight and rangefinder factories, probably the 2 most important factories in Germany, were still going. And as a last point, more slave laborers survived the war due to the chaos that occurred after the raid than the number of German civilians who actually died in the raid. I accept that women and children were innocent, but German women and children had the opportunity to leave the cities, something slave laborers and Jews, for example, never had. So when it comes to the innocence of German civilians, I think we've got it all wrong.
So, Marcus, if at the start of the show, we talked about sort of some of the origins of Bomber Command, that Churchill was an advocate, that it was a way to kind of bring force to bear against the Germans without engaging the Wehrmacht. Based on your analysis of the whole history of this force, which is different than is often commonly accepted, what happens if there is no Bomber Command? What does the war look like if those people in 1933, 34, 35 hadn't said that this is something we want to do? If they had done, say, what the Germans do, which is not develop a strategic bomber force, what does this war effort look like?
Well, I think it would have gone on for another 2 or 3 years minimum. certainly. On Omaha Beach, you remember the Americans had a terrible time. Then they almost canceled the landing at that particular beach. There were only 2 88mm guns at Omaha Beach. There are only 120 in the whole of Normandy. If there had been no Bomber Command, there would probably been 2,000 or 3,000 in Normandy, and probably 200 along the beaches of Normandy, probably 20 or 30 at Omaha Beach, the same at Utah. We would not have got ashore on D-Day on any of those beaches had those heavy guns been there. So that's really one reason. And the seaborne invasions in Italy would probably have been near to impossible as well. In addition, German industry would have been untouched, so they could have carried on building and constructing probably at least 50 to 100,000 more Luftwaffe aircraft than they did. And probably about 1/3 of all Tiger I tanks were not constructed due to the destruction of the spare parts components subsector that supplied the main places in Kassel and etc. So at the Battle of Kursk, the pivotal Battle of Kursk, there were only 100 Tiger tanks. So if there'd have been 600 or even 500, the whole battle would have been very different indeed. So really, when I say it's Bomber Command and the American Air Force is all decisive, that's what I mean.
Well, Chris, you asked the question I was just about to ask. So the thought that I had about this was, okay, all of the Germans would have had all these resources that they wouldn't have had because Bomber Command took them out. But at the same time, you have to argue that the British would have had more people that they put into battle or put into industry. They would have had all the money that was spent buying airplanes, could have been spent building tanks, building ships, etc. So, it may not have been as quite as one-sided, right? Because you're looking at one side, but there's sort of two sides to that.
Well, the principal way that we won World War II was by not fighting the German army when we could. That's basic. We didn't repeat World War I, and the reason we didn't is because we used Air Force to pound the German army into oblivion, both at the front lines and all of its supplies, etc. And so that's why it's so important. The Allies did not come up with a comparable tank to the Germans until the last weeks of the war, frankly. And even the T-34 was a pretty hopeless tank against the German armor as well. I don't think there was an American or a British division that seriously bothered the equivalent German army division until really the last few months of the war, because the combined tactics and the firepower of the average German army division was far greater than ours in terms of effectiveness. And that's just the truth. That's why air power to bomb the German army to oblivion was so important.
So Marcus, I think, given the contributions of Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force and the whole strategic bombing offensive, you would think that that the force would have, received the thanks of a grateful nation, and the praise would be voluminous, and you wouldn't have to write a book refuting the popular impression that we all have of Bomber Command. So what was the reception given to Bomber Command after they helped secure this great victory? And why is it not what you kind of would have expected?
Well, that's a very good question, and one that's not easy to answer. Churchill, unfortunately, stepped back from praising and promoting Bomber Command after the incident at Dresden, and unfortunately, that was a great error in my view. He didn't mention Bomber Command in his victory speech, though he didn't actually mention others. It wasn't a very long speech, and Bomber Command was not given a separate campaign medal after the war, which was incredibly unfair. So I'm incredulous. And also, Harris did not get his, he was not made a lord, a peerage, the way that all the other British senior commanders all were given one. And again, that was very unfair. Of course, by the time the end of the war had happened, Churchill had left power. He lost the election, and a man called Clement Attlee was now prime minister. And funnily enough, people don't know, the man who actually ordered the raid on Dresden, it wasn't Air Marshal Harris, and it wasn't even Churchill. It was a man called Clement Attlee, who was our deputy prime minister during the war. Churchill and Portal were both away at the Yalta conference at the time of the Dresden raid. I mean, it had already been pre-planned, but the man who didn't give Air Marshal Harris his knighthood or much else was the same man who ordered the raid on Dresden personally, and he's not the man who's blamed for the Dresden raid. It's Air Marshal Harris. So if you want to tot up all the unfairnesses of history, this is a very good example of what it can be like to be supremely good at your job and then be condemned at the end of it. And by the way, the British have a very nasty habit of doing this in our history. First of all, at the end of the Spanish Armada, the sailors were left to starve to death at Dover after the Battle of Waterloo and the Crimea. Many of the soldiers were just abandoned to their fate on starvation diets. So at the end of the World War II, for Bomber Command to be abandoned and vilified, I'm afraid it's part of British military history, which is not very nice.
Mm. Well, Marcus Gibson, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. Hold up the cover of your book again. Chris, hold up the cover of his book too.
Yep, we got it.
You got it?
That's very kind of you.
Chris has got it there. We have See It, The Greatest Force, how RAF Bomber Command. I can't read the whole subtitle.
How RAF Bomber Command rose to become the #1 factor in the destruction of Germany in World War II.
Okay, so interesting stuff. Marcus, thank you again for joining us today on the show.
Thank you, Marcus, very much.
Thank you both. Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So lots to chew on from that interview and to think about. And somebody asked a question. They said, really, was it 42,000 slave labor camps? And I was Googling it quickly, and I came up with 44,000. So 42,000 is the conservative number. But if you think about all the slave laborers who were in Germany, and if a camp only had 300 or 400 people, it quickly becomes you need lots and lots of those camps to fill out that whole group.
Keep things going. Yes.
Yeah. So next week, Chris, it is the first show of season 7.
Ta-da.
Okay. Older and wiser hosts here. Ready for season 7. And we're welcoming back Jack Kelly, who's been on a couple of times, to talk about his new book on Thomas Paine. And I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it turns out that January is just 250 years since Common Sense came out.
Well, and I think it's also no coincidence. I'll have to send it to you, but on Spotify, Anna found this great folk song called Tom Paine's Bones, which is very, very good. Maybe we can play it sometime during
Tom Paine's Bones. Yeah, let's try to turn our interview show into a music show. I think that's a plan.
Well, I change it up. It's season 7. We got
right. Oh, we have to. Everything has to be different. Do I have to change everything in the week? We have. Well, no, we should have look different. We could wear different clothes.
We could have like the History Happy Hour players after the opening monologue, and we could go like this, and the band would be there.
Right. We could act out scenes from the book that we're talking about, and then ask the author to be a critic of the scenes that we're acting out.
Well, then I think we should do some more books about like vacations through history, or the importance of Bermuda and the American Revolution, or something like that.
Oh, I've got a whole Bermuda story there for you, but you know that.
You told me that story, man.
I know you know. Okay, guys, again, thank you for joining us, not just today, but all through 2025 and all the preceding years. Unbelievable. Subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.